Folklinos, welcome to Fabric of Folklore. I am your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and this is the show where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. And on this show, we really love stories. Stories are captivating. They captivate our heart and our minds, and they really help us to connect to one another. But in the show, we are really attempting to understand the stories behind the stories. We want to dig deeper, because the stories behind the stories help us to understand the threads that connect us. We want to understand their significance and their history and their generational impact on one another. And when we understand those threads and we're able to pull them together, we're able to see that we are more alike than we are different. So if that sounds like a show that is interesting to you, please subscribe. And if you are a listener of our show and you're enjoying our show, rating and reviewing, giving us those stars is so helpful for a new podcast. So please make sure you're doing that if you enjoy the content. And we have a fantastic guest for you today. Her name is Maida Owens, and she's a cultural anthropologist specializing in Louisiana traditional cultures and works as a Folklife Program Director with the Louisiana Folklore Society on the Bayou Culture Collaborative to help coastal Louisiana sustain their traditional cultures by offering workshops and supporting local efforts. In her role with the Division of Arts, she has identified traditional folk artists as a vital asset to the state and works with Louisiana's folk musicians, storytellers, and craftsmen to share their knowledge. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So I always like to start out with a just kind of an intro to your background. So are you from Louisiana originally?
Yeah, I was born in New Orleans, raised in Baton Rouge, been here almost all of my life.
And so how did you get into folklore, into cultural anthropology? What brought you there?
Well, I started early. In high school, I took a college class and signed up for intro to cultural anthropology, and I was hooked from there. I got my degrees, and then in my job, I work as a folklorist, but my degree is in cultural anthropology.
And can you kind of walk us through how folklore and cultural anthropology are similar, but also are different? Like what makes them different from one another?
There's a lot of overlap. But cultural anthropologists can get into all kinds of work that are not related to expressive culture. And then the folklore is kind of a multidisciplinary field, multidisciplinary discipline, because in folklore you have people coming from literature studies, so they may have degrees in English. People primarily focused on music with ethnomusicologists, whereas in anthropology, under that umbrella, you might have people who are working with HUD or on housing and all kinds of other human systems that don't directly involve expressive culture.
And expressive culture would be, can you explain what that means?
Yeah, the stories, the music, the lifeways, the traditions. I use a very, very broad definition of folklore, and that's why the department my office is called the Folklife Program. So it's not. I might fund a healer, a traiteur, or hunting or living off the land type of traditions that still are under the umbrella of folklore, but not all folklorists include some of the things that I work with.
So would you say that folklore has a wider scope than cultural anthropology?
No, I think they're both very wide scopes. They're just different. There is overlap, but because cultural anthropology can get into a whole lot, much more with linguistics and human systems that are not related to the expressive culture. There's still culture, it's just not the expressive culture.
Right.
Not
Well, awesome.
much. Folklorists tend to talk a lot about traditions, whereas anthropologists, that's just one of their the things that they might talk about.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. So when I was describing your work, it seems to me that there are a lot of different groups that are working on this project that you are currently working on. So I counted three: the Louisiana Folklife Society, the Louisiana Folklore Society, and the Bayou Culture Collective. Are
Yeah, well,
is
that's
that
not the Louisiana Folklife Society. That I think you're referring to the Louisiana Folklife Program, which is my government. I'm in a governmental agency, and so that's the name of our the Louisiana Folklore Society is a modeled on a learned society, a 501c3 nonprofit. Um,
okay?
and then the Bayou Culture Collaborative isn't actually a legal entity. It's an initiative of the Louisiana Folklore Society.
Okay. Okay, but it seems like there are a lot of hands
Oh, yes,
in this project.
many, many, many hands. And I think that's part of why we're successful. That that this is a lot of people coming together who are concerned about what's called the human dimension in environmental planning. That, in Louisiana, for the most part, until recently, and the tide is definitely changing here, most of the money and the time and every focus went into the science of the coast. Uh,
Okay.
and so, where should a river diversion be? Where are mangroves needed to be planted so that it slows down a storm surge?
Hmm.
But the human dimension is not only the culture, but mental health, land use patterns. So there's a lot to the human dimension. Our primary focus is on some of the cultural issues. And me personally is I'm intrigued with the climate migration that has already been happening and is simply accelerating right now.
And I definitely want to get back to that climate migration, but I I'm curious where the change of mindset came from just purely the scientific environmental element to when they started to consider the human element.
Well, you have to consider who they is.
Right.
Who is the they? The state agency, CPRA, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, is a state agency, and they are charged with restoring the coast. So they have taken a very physical approach to it. We're going to restore the physical coast. And while their long term plans did include addressing some of the human dimension and people issues farther down the line, CPRA is starting to think about the human dimension. But there are lots and lots of nonprofits and different types of constituency groups that are very involved in so many different aspects. This is a huge umbrella again. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and different people take different focuses. Um, but how we got started, let me tell you our origin story.
Yes, let's hear it.
In 2017, a man named Jonathan Foray who lives in Homa, and he directs the South Louisiana Wetlands Discovery Center. So they are a science education organization. But Jonathan is from that area, and Terrebonne Parish being having the highest rate of loss of any parish, and I think it's right up there worldwide in the amount of land loss that's been happening there.
Hmm.
He is has a Cajun background. His family's been there for generations, and so he started realizing that what's going to happen to us in this whole process, because
Mm-hmm.
when the land is literally being washed out from under your feet, eventually you're going to need to move. And so where people move and what happened, he started asking the question of what happens to the culture and all of our traditions. Louisiana loves to talk about how important our culture is, our music, our food, and but how much is actually done to support that?
Mm-hmm.
The typical, people tend to think, oh, that'll all just take care of itself. Well, it will, but things may change a lot more than people realize. For
Mm-hmm.
example, um, how many people are wishing their grandparents and parents had spoken French to them. So now
Right.
French is quite endangered here. But so Jonathan invited the Louisiana Folklore Society to come have their annual meeting in Houma, and we had we very intentionally had discussions about how could the Louisiana Folklore Society address this. But he really challenged us, and we heard. And so, what ended up evolving in the next year was the Bayou Culture Collaborative. And so
Okay.
it is simply an initiative of the Louisiana Folklore Society. And at first, we started this with no money, no resources. Um, so being in a state agency with a budget, I realized I was in a position to even start to addressing this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I redirected some funds that I have, and decided to experiment with ways to support the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I identified two major needs. One is to support the culture directly and to make sure that important traditions are passed on. And
Mm-hmm.
so I ended up with the passing it on what evolved into the passing it on workshops. But then the second one was I realized that the Arts and Culture Network in the state was really not part of this conversation. And there was no means for people to communicate, to talk about it. And then I realized, well, they're so uninvolved that they really need to have workshops or opportunities to learn about what's actually happening, because even though Louisiana is on the forefront of climate change, especially with sea level rise and land loss, um, that doesn't mean everybody wakes up every day thinking about this.
Right.
And even people who have heard something, they go back to their life. Even those who are relatively aware, if your employment, your family can't, depending on what your situation in life is, most people don't have the luxury of being able to devote a lot of time to this
Right.
and thinking about it. They just go on with their lives. And so that, of course, is happening all over South Louisiana. So what I wanted to do was to make sure that cultural leaders, especially, and artists, had a means, what could find out more. Although some of them are already very aware and already very active. So anyway, I started what I call sense of place and loss workshops. And the
Mm.
first one was in person, and the idea was to bring together um, a scientist, people from the arts and culture communities, and policymakers for dialogues. And so
Yeah.
this was intended to be an in-person series. Well, the second one was scheduled the uh, week of the lockdown.
Oh, of course.
And so that was definitely canceled. And so I thought, well, what can I do? And so I started having Zoom meetings
Mm.
and Zoom workshops where I invited speakers, and it was like an hour and a half workshop where we presented ideas and the main audience at that time was the Arts Network. And then we had a second one in 2020. Oh no, this was 21. Um, uh, just for artists, focusing on the role of the artist. Um, and so then the next stage was the Louisiana Folklore Society decided they wanted to be more active. And so we acquired arts funding to do, and humanities funding, the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities too. And we started producing monthly online gatherings. And so that has continued since January 2022. And they feature a speaker, but we try to be more than simply a speaker series. We have time for dialogues. And we were shocked that we thought it would take about 6 months for this to get some steam rolling. But 150 people registered for the first one, and 90
That's
showed up.
wonderful.
So in hindsight, we realized we showed up at just the right time, because and we learned that a lot of the environmentalists have long time been concerned about the human dimension issues, and not just to support the physical restoration of the coast, because early on a lot of the initiatives looked at traditional ecological knowledge as something that would help the engineers and the scientists figure out how best to do something. And so it was, in many ways, it was an extractive process, extracting this knowledge in order to figure out what needs to be done. But we wanted to push it further. We wanted to hear the voices of people, and we did. Very successful. We get 40 to 60 every month, something like that. And once in a while, a topic will come up that gets even more. And one of the interesting milestones is just a couple of weeks ago was the State of the Coast meeting. And that generally has been, scientists talking to scientists or engineers talking to engineers. And this year, they were overwhelmed with the number of people proposing human dimension related topics. And there were so many that I couldn't go to all of them because they were at the same time. So
Yeah, how fascinating.
I wish it had been recorded so that I could go back and watch all of them. But
yeah, I was going to ask because I feel like people outside of Louisiana might be interested in this as well. And so are there plans to have these sessions recorded, these monthly sessions recorded?
the monthly, all of them are, and all of them are on YouTube.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, we'll definitely link that up to our website so people can have access to that. But what were you saying was not recorded?
The State of the Coast.
Okay.
Because that's the Council to Restore Coastal Louisiana, CRCL, produces that, and they are, they partner with CPRA, the state agency, in order to do this. And so they mentioned it in the intros, and that we were really so pleased to have this whole new track in State of the Coast, that focuses more on the people and processes, everything from mental health to land use.
So for people who are not familiar with Louisiana and what's happening with the coast, can you give a brief paint the picture for us?
Yeah. It all started really in this last century, where after the 1927 flood, which was devastating, everything from Baton Rouge to Lafayette South was under 8 feet of water. So that's a significant flood. And the Corps of Engineers started to build levees and try to control the river. Well, that started the process of the coast eroding, because a river delta is built by land, by new soil being deposited. Most of South Louisiana.
What river were we talking about?
The Mississippi River.
Okay.
And so all of that soil was being deposited way out in the Gulf instead of building land and nurturing the marshes and such. The other thing that started happening was the oil and gas industry started cutting canals through the marsh in order to get to their wells. Well, what that did was provide a means for saltwater intrusion to get up into the marsh and start killing the marsh. And so now we're talking about backfilling those canals, but so much damage has already been done. And the third major factor is sea level rise. That it's, of course, it's already risen some, and then a fourth would be the fact that subsidence, where the ground, without the water holding the marsh together, it starts getting packed down. So that ends up being, the land compacting, in other words. And back we talked about a fifth one, and I asked, why don't y'all ever talk about that anymore? Because I thought that was fascinating. And the whole continental shelf is breaking. It's basically, so South Louisiana is part of the continental shelf, but they said that that's really not as big of a factor, and most of the time you need to keep things really simple. So having that many factors involved complicates things.
So what does that physically mean for Louisiana? What is happening? Are people having to move away from the coastal lands? What is it physically meaning?
Well, actually, there's an excellent video I can share with you that shows exactly what's happened in Southeast Louisiana with the land loss going, I think it covers 100 years in 1 minute. And you can
wow.
Yeah, you can really see it if you want to insert that later.
Yeah, we'll link that up too.
But basically, the river delta is changing so much, and primarily in Southeast Louisiana. Southwest Louisiana also has issues, but what's so dramatic is Southeast Louisiana, especially Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes. So what's happening now is small communities are actively collapsing.
Like the land themselves, the land is
the community. I'm going to the human dimension where we're talking about the communities, and so as people people lose their backyards. In Louisiana, it's the opposite with most areas, where the closer you are to the water, the higher the land, and as you go away from the river or the bayou, that's where you get marshy or swampy, and that's because of the way the river delta is created. The soil, most of the soil, when you have a flood, the soil deposits immediately, so you end up having a natural levee. But now we've built additional levees on top of the natural levees.
Well, in Louisiana itself, I remember I've been to New Orleans a couple of times, and I remember them saying that it's one of the only cities that's below sea level.
Yeah, well, they've built, there are parts of New Orleans that are actually below sea level, and if we didn't have the levees, the flood walls, the pumps, New Orleans would probably already be underwater in parts.
And when you say parishes, are those like our counties?
Yes.
Okay.
We're the only state that has parishes.
So let's talk about the climate migration. What does that term mean? I've never actually heard that phrase before.
Yeah, climate migration refers to people who are moving because of environmental changes and due to climate change.
And that's where you were talking about the community collapsing.
Yeah, there's the physical collapse of the community where, there's less and less land. And so that ends up affecting individual households, and then very importantly is businesses. And when services start closing, and even things like schools, people end up making hard decisions to leave a community that their family may go back generations. And so the question is, where do they go? And in Louisiana, the typical pattern is to move up the bayou, the next highest ground. So, but what that does is mean that many families have to move multiple times, because in 10 years, 20 years, the land erosion is that much more, and more, more and more businesses and services are farther away. And right now, Terrebonne Parish is in the process of closing quite a few schools. And so kids are having to be bused into Homa to schools. And so, if your kid misses the bus, that's a 40-minute drive to drop them off and then return home, and hopefully they don't miss the bus in the afternoon. But so it ends up impacting lifestyle quite a bit.
So these migrations, how is it affecting the cultural traditions?
Well, any kind of disruption is. My screen went blank for some reason. Let me log back in. I hope y'all can edit.
I can see you still.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't move my mouse enough. Yeah. So culture changes. That's nothing new, and that's not gonna. You don't want to freeze dry your culture. Culture adapts, it changes, it evolves. But in disruption, the change can be quite dramatic. And so if you're leaving your network, your social network and your community, you're more likely to lose a lot of your heritage and in your new home. Now you can do things about that, and there are a lot of people who do, and they find they find expats elsewhere. And immigrants have been doing this. There's a lot to be learned from immigrants. They've been doing this for always. All the immigrant organizations that culture is very important, whether it's a culture school or culture camps, or whether it's church based or however it is. But in their new home, they need to get together, but they may not be from the same bayou, the same community. And so some things are going to change, but there's still ways you can make sure that it's passed on, either formally or informally. So back to the community is, 5 families move to this community, and some others move farther up. Some of them jump up all the way to Homa. Some of them go all the way. They go to Baton Rouge or New Orleans. Those are an hour and a half away. So yes, you can maintain contact, but it's not the same as living on the same street and down the street from your grandmother, and and maintaining all those ties. So what I'm interested in doing is helping people become aware of the issues and strategies to help people. And I'm especially interested in trying to influence policymakers. For example, could the state, and I don't necessarily I don't have the answers, but my questions are, what could we be doing now? How could we help people move together, not forced migration, But if they do elect to take the buyout, or they do just simply need to move, helping them identify what's called receiver communities. And one of the major problems with receiving communities is having adequate housing stock to take
Mm-hmm.
in numbers of newcomers. So this requires some serious planning. This is not
Mm-hmm.
something that's easy to do. Um, but I think there are things we can do to help communities move together and not lose this culture that we love to talk about all the time. How important our
Yeah.
culture is, you know.
Absolutely. So I did have a question about the ecological knowledge that the coastal restoration is really trying to tap into. Can you talk a little bit about that? What that looks like?
Yeah, traditional ecological knowledge is all that knowledge of living off the land.
Hmm.
It's knowing when to plant the tomatoes. It's where when the shrimp are running. You know the medicinal herbs. You know, it's also foraging, going out and finding traditional plants for medicines and tonics and such. So it's that deep knowing about the ecological system,
Mm-hmm.
but it's from experience. It's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily from books,
Right.
and um, and and so yes, we need both of these. And I just recently learned about Devin Parfay's work, where he talks about the two-eyed knowledge. You need to look through both eyes, one Western science and indigenous traditional knowledge.
Mm.
Now he's indigenous, so he's very focused on that. But anybody that's living off the land and really knows it, like out west, the ranchers who really know how, um, you know, the subtleties of working with the land, and farmers all over, unless I guess they're the corporate ones that tend to be monoculture, mono agriculture, and not really pay attention to the land. Um, so it's not just indigenous, but I really like that idea that he says you have to look out of both eyes.
Yeah. I
And
like that idea too.
mhm.
So, can you talk a little bit about the strategies that have been suggested or strategies that you've been thinking about? Besides, you were mentioning having a place for them all to move together, so that if they so wish. Can you talk about any of the other strategies?
Well, again, we what we're trying to do is build a community of people who are concerned, and not necessarily give them answers, but to help provide a room for people to explore the answers. Now,
Mm-hmm.
nationally, there are some things that are happening. For example, one of the biggest issues is the fact that marginalized people will continue to be marginalized unless the planners take that into consideration. And there's some really interesting research on that, where um, um, they all of the coastal parish counties in the country that are going to experience sea level rise and displacement, there's a disproportionate number of African Americans, specifically, not just people of color, but African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
um, who will be displaced. So they will be disproportionately affected if if colorblind planning continues. So one of the things is to take this into consideration and reserve some of the higher ground for people of color, or different types of marginalized, because the reason they're flooding first is they were pushed onto the less desirable land.
Mm.
So that will just keep happening unless you do something different. So the primary strategy that I've heard of so far is land banks.
Land banks?
Banks.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where some of the highlands, some of the desirable land is reserved, not for the developers. Now, it's incredibly complicated, and it's, for example, right now in Little Haiti in Miami area, they're talking about this, that their community is being gentrified so quickly, and so they're pushing back and saying, let's figure out a way to save this community without having to leave. Because, and also Little Haiti, the higher ground there used to be less desirable, like because people wanted to be on the beaches. So they ended up in Little Haiti, but now people are worried about being on the beaches and they want higher ground, so they're displacing them. But
right.
What they're trying to do is create a land bank. It's very complicated because, you know, who buys out the landowners? Every inch of land is owned by somebody or the government, and so, you know, how does this happen? It's very complicated.
Yes, I know, you know, I'm in Texas and we have some of the same issues, not quite as extreme.
No, your Gulf Coast is just as it's happening.
Yeah. And I know that it's complicated as well because there's a certain amount of land that is always public, but that erosion is causing the public land to creep onto private land, and then it's causing a lot of problems with legal issues because of how our state defines what is public beach land and what is privatized, and yeah, for sure. Can you talk about what colorblind planning looks like and how what it looked like before and how it's trying to be combated? I'm unfamiliar with that terminology, colorblind planning.
Well, that's just not taking color, you know, into consideration in your planning. And so, you know, the developers get the best land, the land gets gentrified.
And when you say gentrified, that really means that the people who are living there, it becomes too expensive to live there, and then they need to move. Is that really the crux of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex topic, and but it's like you're reading in the papers nowadays about how Washington, D.C. has pushed out so many of the African American communities because people, you know, the neighborhood shifted, and well, the poor African American. I wouldn't want to imply that all African Americans
right.
would have to be pushed out because they can't afford it. But yeah, if property taxes in the area start going up so much, new taxation districts, and so they can't, even if they're in a multi-generational house that there is no mortgage in for it, the area can still get too expensive, or they take the money and run, which is that's for the individual. I'm not going to tell any one individual what they should do. And I respect that if somebody decides that they do need to sell out and take the money and run. Because I've faced that myself. At what point do I need to leave? Maybe in the next 10 years, it might get more and more difficult here, but there's so many different predictions. It's hard stuff. It's real hard stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to make the decision between individual and community. How to balance that. You want to stay with your community, but sometimes you have to make a decision for yourself.
And community is really hard to define. And a lot of anthropologists don't want to use that term anymore. folklorists use it all the time. But it's so hard to define. Is it people living in a geographic area? Is it a
Mm-hmm.
network? And a really good example of that is what has happened in one of the communities in South Louisiana that was on an island that was gradually flooding. And define community. Is it a tribe? Is it, they assume that everybody on the island was part of the tribe, and that was not the case at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, and who gets to speak for the community? That's a huge issue. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
who has assumed being leader of the community and spokesperson versus who actually has the support. You know, who named you boss?
Right.
Who said you could speak for us? And sometimes it's the political leaders, and sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Informal leaders that are, you know.
Can you give us, so we've been talking about, the concerns about what's happening. Can you really lay out some examples of what stands to be lost with all of this climate migration and this moving? What are some traditions that we've already seen disappear, for instance?
Well, that relates to the passing it on workshops. We've mainly been talking about my strategy to make more people aware of what's going on in South Louisiana and the role that they might play in it. But the other thing is, what traditions are endangered to actually die out. And there I have two strategies. One is to work directly with the tradition bearer. And frequently sometimes I contact them and inform them about this opportunity. But now that we've been doing it for several years, I've started getting cold calls and people saying, I'm interested in this, in doing this. Is that a possibility? And then it's getting to be word of mouth, where they're talking among themselves and they say, hey, she's got money to do workshop, to pay you to do workshops. And so what that idea is for the tradition bearer to have a workshop or a workshop series. Some of them, I think we've had a series of 6 one time. But it depends on the tradition and how deep they want to go. And so they get money in order to do that. And the quality of the learning is what I'm interested in. It's not numbers. And some of them feel like, oh, well, I don't know if I could get 30 people. I said, you don't have to get 30 people. It's the deep experience that we want and quality of time that you're spending with it. And not just a lecture. We want doing. We want activity. Right. So they're kind of like a mini apprenticeship, but not restricted to one-on-one. I have had one that was a mini apprenticeship with one-on-one. So being in this position for so long, I'm aware of some of the traditions that are endangered and very possibly could die out. And so, I contacted people that I knew did these and talked to them about doing them. And some of them took a few years to finally decide, how and when they want to do it. So some examples of the passing it ons that are from tradition bearers. One of the most exciting was just a couple of weeks ago. Geraldine Robertson was the only active split oak basket maker in the state. And she went to live with family in California for 10 years. And so somebody else who had done a workshop let her know that this, that I might be able to support her. And so she contacted me and said, could I said, well, I didn't even know you were back. This is fabulous. She's 81. And it was really interesting because she said, what I want to do is 5 consecutive days in a week to do full day workshops and take them from going to cut the tree down to making a basket in 5 days.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And I said, how are you going to find people that can take off work? Well, that's what she wanted to do, so that's what she did. And so I paired her up with 2 organizations to help her. One, West Baton Rouge Parish Museum, is a small museum right across the river from Baton Rouge, and they immediately fell in love with this idea, and so they said, "We'll take the money, and it'll all go to Geraldine, but we'll provide everything else at our expense." So that's kind of one extreme. And when they had 15 people the first day they announced it. It's like, where did you find 15 people who can go to a week-long series of
That's crazy.
so it was fabulous. And the other thing I did is in that instance was the landowner where she was getting trees suddenly backed out. He leased it for turkey hunting, and so they could not go on the land while the turkey hunting lease was active. So she was in a panic. Where am I going to find trees? And I said, well, let me see if I can ask state parks if we could go on, if you could go on the land and identify them. So I brokered that. And so, yes, she went out to make sure that the trees were actually there on the state parks. And because it's for educational use, this was allowed. I've also done this in the past for a couple of times, not often, on federal lands that are in Louisiana that some pine straw basket makers needed a certain type of the longleaf pine that's no longer um, um, grown commercially. They're short leaf. Most of the commercial pine trees are short leaves, and they don't work as well. And so I brokered that kind of thing before, so this wasn't the first time, but it happened all in one day. It was pretty amazing how quickly it all fell together. So that's a good example of a tradition bearer who I knew and ended up having. But some people just call out of the blue. Sabina Miller called up, and she was all excited and really wanted to offer a workshop, and she was talking about all these different traditions that she could do. It could be storytelling and painting. I said, well, painting generally isn't really folk art. It's more of an idiosyncratic expression. um, and so, but then she said, oh, and I do these, I make wax paper flowers the way my mother did. And so I said, hold it. Because the only person that I knew of that did this still died about 15 years ago. And so this woman just walks in and says, yeah, I do that. And so what it is you make crepe paper flowers and you dip them in wax. And this was the precursor to plastic flowers, especially for graves. And so, once plastic flowers came in, the need wasn't there as much. But a few people continued it. They'll make a flower wreath, especially for All Saints Day and such.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it won't last quite as long as a plastic one.
Well, outside in the weather, they're not going to last very long at all. But inside with they last a lot longer. The wax attracts dust over time, so that but it's intended to be an impermanent item. It's not intended to be a forever flower. So she's a good example of people just coming out of the woodwork saying, I want to, what about what I do? And I don't have money for everybody, but I had a fair amount of money. So we just recently added up that since 2019, we've funded $85,000 in passing it on grants.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and what I said at the State of the Coast. Now I said, well, I know in your world, 85,000 is nothing. It's not even chump change for federal agencies. But in our world, it's huge, and I'm very proud of that. So the other type of passing it on workshop that happens is when I reach out to an organization or community that has not really participated in arts grants before. And I especially wanted to reach out to some of the indigenous communities in Southeast Louisiana that had never gotten an arts grant. So basically, what I do is talk with them about a tradition that is particularly meaningful to them. So I don't tell them, oh no, I want you to do cypress basket making or, something that I'm aware of. So we go through this process of, I share all the different types of things that could be, and they make the decision. And it's usually the community leader that ends up deciding what to do. And then to come up with all kinds of things. Frequently, it's foodways. Some people are very concerned about the children not knowing how to cook, much less knowing how to cook the traditional dishes. And so groups from the Filipino Women's Society of Louisiana, focused on foodways. The Grand Bayou Indian tribe in Plaquemines Parish almost washed away, but they do still have a community center. And so over Thanksgiving holiday one year, they demonstrated 7 different dishes during the day and then had a feast at night.
Oh, wow. That sounds fantastic.
Yes. So it just depends, what's important. Another group, the Grand Bayou, one of the Dulac band of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe. They wanted the kids to know how to do make regalia and costume, dancing. And she said, well, they don't know how to sew. So you first have to teach them how to sew before they can get into adding decorating the regalia. And so that was what was needed. And so that's what we funded. Again, and sometimes it's for the children and sometimes it's for the adults. Sometimes it's a whole community. The Acadian brown cotton weaving is one of the most endangered traditions in the States. So we've done a couple of with different people, really learning the deep learning of knowing how to grow brown cotton, spin it, weave it. So yeah, that's one of our other success stories. But it's been everything from boat building to duck carving to foodways. Not much in music though. We've had very, very little requests.
How interesting, because that's one of the things that Louisiana is so well known for is its blues and jazz and its music.
Well, in some ways, does it need public support at this point? On this scale, like we have arts organizations that are doing concerts and Louisiana Folk Roots has a music camp where you can come and have an immersive experience for fiddling and accordion, and they added a culture track, and so there are other things that are happening, but those are the organizations that have already been participating in the arts network and getting grants.
Oh man, that music camp sounds so fun.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, we're known as a fun state. But so part of my strategies was to reach out to people who had never participated like that. So,
And can you tell me what is one of the most popular of your Pass It On workshops?
Well, that's hard to say because popular kind of implies numbers, and that's not what I'm looking for. Like when I'm talking with people, frequently they say, well, I want to demonstrate this at a festival. Could we add a tent at a festival and do it? I said, well, no, that's having the same conversation, 15-minute conversation 100 times.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went back to smaller, deeper conversations,
Mm-hmm.
smaller groups, deeper conversations is how knowledge is really passed on. So it's not about awareness. It's
Mm-hmm.
about them actually learning some level of skill. Now that dramatically changes what can be accomplished in even a day-long workshop varies. That
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they are an introduction to woodworking, or restoring a pirogue, or you know, cooking a dish, seeing it cooked, um, watching it being cooked, or versus watching your mother-in-law make it 100 times over your lifetime. So
Mm-hmm.
sure, it's not the best of all possible worlds. I wish I had $1 million every year and I could only spend it on that, all to spend on this. But that's not the world that I live in.
So I guess my question would be, how would that trait continue, or the knowledge continue? So let's say I go to a class, a day-long class, and then I've learned the skill, but then I'm not getting together necessarily with those people to like continue doing this. So I have the skill, I maybe keep the basket on my shelf, but how does it continue?
Well, the ones that are more community based, they're part of a community. These are often they're not um, advertised broadly.
Mm-hmm.
It's more, this is for this community. Now, some of them do welcome non people who are not from the community, because you never know what seed is going to sprout.
Mm-hmm.
And I, managing an apprenticeship program for a few decades, I got to the point of feeling like I can't. There's nothing I can do to ensure that every apprenticeship has longevity
Right.
beyond it. But what I can do is help people plant seeds. And you
Mm-hmm.
just never know which ones are going to sprout. That frequently what happens is they can't necessarily, the apprentice may not be able to continue it tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
but after they retire, or when they change, their children get older, or something changes in their life, that they can return to this tradition if, and I think important is, if they if this tradition really has deep meaning for them and their community.
Mm-hmm.
So that if it's just going to a basket making class that you took 5 years ago, you may not return to that. But when it's a tradition that is symbolic of your community, and has deep meaning,
Mm-hmm.
there you're more likely to continue it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe if it's not you, maybe your child sees the basket that you made a while ago and wants to continue that tradition, and maybe it's not you, but maybe it's you can pass on that knowledge.
Yeah, but the deeper the networks, and then the people who have, the tradition bearers that have approached me, frequently they already have a network.
Mm-hmm.
Frequently they have people who have been asking to learn this for years, but they didn't have a means to do it.
Yeah.
And so, that's another way that, for example, Greyhawk Perkins is a United Home and Nation tradition bearer who he does all the above. But one of the things that he does is primitive woodworking skills, and so he wanted to teach people how to make what's called a shaving horse, and that's the contraption that holds a piece of wood while you work it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so I said, well, that's all very good, but how are you going to find people to do this? And he says, oh no, I know the woodworkers. He'd been doing this for years.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this just provided a means for him to, it also helped him set up for future ones, because what he chose to do with some of the funds was to make several shaving horses, uh, for use in classes.
Mm-hmm.
And so at first he wanted to give them all away. And I said, well, consider this, that if you keep them, they won't just end up in somebody's storage room, but you will be having them be being used significantly more. And he thought, yeah, okay. Because so
Mm-hmm.
many of them have such generous hearts. They just want to give everything away
Yeah.
because they're not in business. This is not a business for them.
Right.
Sometimes people are making money from their tradition, but frequently they aren't.
And then, so you also have another workshop that you do, climate migration and welcoming newcomers. What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a much more structured workshop. The full version is 3 hours, but I've done shortened versions for different settings. That is where, for a defined group, and usually it's some kind of peer group,
Mm-hmm.
or it's part of a conference. I started with the first one I did was Louisiana Main Street managers, all the people in the state who manage the Main Street programs.
Mm-hmm.
And then a national Main Street got involved, and after I did that, they wanted me to do it at Main Street Now, the national conference. And then there are 56 people in the country who have the type of job that I have, and we gather every 2 years at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. And so for the pre-conference, my workshop was included in their professional development program. And so we ended up inviting a lot more to attend than just the people who have my type of job, because all the state arts agencies around the country they vary dramatically in resources and staff and
Mm-hmm.
expertise and such. So a lot of people, we had more than probably 60 or 70 people in the room that day. And so then somebody there wanted me to present to the Appalachian Network, Appalachian Funders Network. And so, because they realize that they are going to be a major receiving community, and so they're worried about outsiders overwhelming their traditional culture.
Mm-hmm.
So there's angst on both sides. Earlier we were talking about what could be called ascending or collapsing communities, but the receiving communities have all kind of issues too, and
Mm-hmm.
that has totally fascinated me, because you leave to migrate, you leave one place and you go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And so what can be done to support the people who want to leave, and the people who want to move, but also the long-term residents of where you move to, they have concerns. And so in this workshop, one of the major areas of welcoming newcomers is talking about how arts programming can help the newcomers get to know the long-term residents and vice versa,
Mm-hmm.
and co-create space. And the emphasis is on the co there.
Mm-hmm.
Everything needs to be planned. It's basically all the typical arts projects that you know of, but including the community members in the planning and selecting.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful book, Bridging Divides, that talks about all this, and I have a resource list that everything in my workshops I have links for, and everything is online and free. But they talk about storytelling, foodways, quilting and other types of fiber work, and traditional ecological knowledge being the traditions that can most effectively bring people together and have, like violin lessons or fiddle lessons is not the time, that requires a certain expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so these traditions it's easier, it's an easier entree, it's easier sell in the community. But
Mm-hmm.
you still need to work with the community to figure out. But artists exchange, quilters that from the newcomers and quilters from the long-term residents, and help them get to know each other. Then they do a public exhibit of whatever it is they produce. That's just
Mm-hmm.
1,000 community gardens,
Mm-hmm.
but all kinds of ways to help the newcomers be accepted by the long-term residents and vice versa.
What is generally the concern of the receiving community? What are they
Being
concerned is going to
displaced.
happen?
Gentrification is, well, at this point in climate migration, is what's called means migration. The people who have the means to leave do, and they tend to be middle class and educated
Mm-hmm.
first, leaving behind communities left with the elderly and more poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So when the middle class and the educated leave, where do they go? Well, they may be coming with more resources than the community is. They overwhelm it. So there's
Mm-hmm.
just gentrification stories all over the country, and so climate is simply going to add to that dynamic of new people coming in and overwhelming long-term communities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, well, is there anything we haven't covered? This has just been such a fascinating conversation.
Well, as you can tell, I can talk forever about
Yeah, this is, I mean, there's a lot here, and this is,
well,
I could,
and I guess at the beginning, what I try to say at the beginning of my workshops is to frame it that major changes are happening in the next 10 years, both
what are we seeing? What
mentally
changes?
and but also the economy. They talk about the third industrial revolution coming. There's going to be so much changes in employment, and the way we work. And I'm not talking about remote. That was just a blip in what's been known to be coming for quite a while. And then all the environmental changes, the increased hazards, and so where there is no safe place, that has perfect weather right now, you know, for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so what people will end up having to make decisions for themselves. Is do I stay here and weather storms, or like I'm less scared about the hurricanes, although I'm not living right there on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what I find confounding is the extreme precipitation. That how do you plan for a microburst?
Mm-hmm.
In 2016, Louisiana had two major extreme precipitation events. They're not named storms because they're not a storm. They just come out of nowhere. And you don't see them coming hardly. And one community just north of Baton Rouge had 36 inches of rain in 36 hours. It's like and somebody said, "Oh, that's biblical." I said, "Yes, that's
Yeah.
incredible."
And so, and then it causes a lot of damage. They have flash flooding and whatnot.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
People had 5 feet of water in places that had never flooded, and this is nowhere near the coast. Baton Rouge is not near the coast. Although, if sea level rise predictions continue, just south of Baton Rouge will be the coast.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that
Now,
is definitely concerning.
it might be 100 years, but that's all. Most of Louisiana's population is south of I-10. Baton Rouge to Lafayette South and New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. And so
That
they
one's
would be having to completely relocate.
Well, now they're talking. They're some people say, let's get innovative. Let's create towns of houseboats, because people used to live on houseboats here all the time.
Uh-huh.
Not as much now. They're more recreational. But can people afford a houseboat that has all the amenities that people have come to expect?
And can they weather hurricane weather?
Well, the thing about houseboats, you could move it. You could move it inland.
Okay.
That's the whole point of the houseboat, rather than a floating house. There are also proposals of floating houses. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
we may get innovative, and some of those may work pretty well. But the bottom line is there's going to be massive disruption in the coming years.
Right.
We just happen to be on the forefront. But we're coming to a neighborhood near you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was so fascinating, and I feel like I've learned so much. And I'm a neighbor of Louisiana, so we've visited Louisiana several times, and it's just, you're right. Your culture is just, it's just beautiful, and there's so many unique elements of Louisiana that we definitely want to keep alive. So I think the work that you're doing is just fantastic.
Well, Texas is the #1 destination for Louisianans leaving the state, so we're coming to you.
I know we had that hurricane. I think Katrina. After Katrina, we got a lot of Louisianans who moved here.
That is the migration modelers, that it's documented. That's where we go. That's the #1 destination.
Where in Texas do they stay east in the
That's
eastern?
a good question. I don't know. But people move for jobs and family. Those are other than before all the climate issues,
Mm-hmm.
the primary reasons people move are jobs and family.
Mm-hmm.
So unless they may have Texas relatives that have moved there before, so they're going to there. But Texas has jobs.
Well, I'm looking forward to those newcomer receiving communities and how they're going to co-create spaces for the Texas culture and Louisiana cultures, because that's going to be a very interesting mix. So thank you so much. And thank you, Focalinos. What did you know about the culture of Louisiana prior to this podcast? Have you ever heard the term climate migration? Have you seen it in your communities? Have you had to move, or do you know of people who've had to move? Did anything surprise you? We want to hear from you. We have a Facebook community page where this is where we can have these conversations. I really want our Facebook Fabric of Folklore community Facebook group page to be a place where people can have these conversations and keep the conversation going after the podcast has already aired. And all of the links that we have talked about in the show will be listed at the www.fabricoffolklore.com website. And so we have everything. We'll put up everything over there. And we're also we have a Facebook page. We're on Instagram. We're now on Twitter. And this is a YouTube show, but also you can just listen on whatever podcasting streaming service that you use, whether that's Apple or Spotify, Google. We're on most of those platforms. And please comment, like, share, give us a review. That is so helpful for our podcast to be found by other people. Give us stars. And if you give us a review, I will name you out on our podcast to thank you. So once again, thank you so much for joining us to unravel the mysteries of folklore. My name is Vanessa Y. Rogers, and you've been joining us on Fabric of Folklore. Goodbye.